Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Paris in the 1920s. Not the Paris of guidebooks and postcards, but a Paris that never slept, where smoke curled lazily from cafe doors, where dimly lit rooms buzzed with soft laughter, and where music drifted across cobbled streets like perfume in the night. It was a city of secrets, of whispered conversations, and of women who lived beyond the lines drawn for them. Women who called themselves free, who painted and wrote, who loved and lost, and who moved through that decade like shadows with fire in their eyes. Tonight, I will take you into that world, not with drama or urgency, but with calmness, as if we were leafing through forgotten pages of an old diary. Paris in the 1920s was a paradox, a city that seemed both exhausted from war and yet intoxicated with a life. The scars of the Great War lingered in the silence of widows and the missing faces at dinner tables, but the boulevards themselves pulsed with a strange defiance, as though the entire city had agreed to breathe again, louder than before. In the quiet corners of Montparnasse, far from the grandeur of the Champs-Élysées, there lived women who would later be called Bohemian, though at the time they hardly thought of themselves that way. They were simply searching for something more than what the world had prescribed. Their stories do not arrive to us with neat chapters or formal introductions. They drift like cigarette smoke through memory and rumor. To listen to them is to surrender to a kind of drowsy wandering, as though each life were a lantern flickering against the night of history. In those dim cafés, where chairs were scraped across uneven floors and wine was poured into chipped glasses, you might have seen one of these women bent over a sketchbook, her hair pinned back with little care, her fingers stained with charcoal. She would be unremarkable to the passer-by, another face in the crowd, and yet the moment you looked longer, something set her apart. Perhaps it was the way she laughed without lowering her voice, or the way she refused to look away when someone stared too long. Bohemian women of Paris in that time lived without the safety nets society offered to others. They did not marry for security, they did not work for mere wages, and they did not remain within the boundaries of what was deemed respectable. Instead, they shared cramped apartments with peeling wallpaper, lived on bread, cheap wine, and black coffee, and yet carried within them a fierce hunger to write, to paint, to sing, to live fully, even if only for a brief and uncertain moment. And if you, dear listener, have found yourself drifting into this calm journey, I invite you gently to pause and notice something. As you listen, as your eyelids grow heavy, take just a moment to support this space. A quiet click on the subscribe button, a simple like on this video. It helps keep these stories alive so that each night you return, more voices from forgotten corners of history will be waiting for you. Tell me softly as you hear my words, are you listening in the hush of midnight or in the stillness of early morning, or perhaps during an afternoon rest? Wherever you are, this story now belongs to your time, your silence, your evening. And we continue. The word Bohemian itself carried a strange weight. To the respectable bourgeois families of Paris, it was a term of dismissal, wild, unruly, improper. But within the narrow streets of Montparnasse, it was a badge of freedom. Bohemian women gathered in salons that smelled faintly of paint thinner and cheap candles, and there they traded not only ideas, but also courage. One wrote poems on torn paper bags. Another played piano on a half-broken instrument that went out of tune in the middle of the night. And still another painted canvases, so large they had to lean them out of windows to dry. They had no certainty of success. For many, their names would be lost, their works destroyed, their lives reduced to whispers. And yet, for a brief moment, they burned brightly enough to leave shadows. Montparnasse was the heart of this world, though by day it looked ordinary enough. Bakeries with their warm loaves, bookshops with dusty shelves, children running through alleys. By night, however, the neighborhood changed. Artists and writers crowded into bars with low ceilings and smoky air. Jazz, imported from across the Atlantic, spilled from gramophones and made even the most hesitant feet tap along. It was here, amid the clinking of glasses and the scratch of pens, that Bohemian women found each other. They were often outsiders in more ways than one, not just as women, but as immigrants, as queer, as dreamers unwilling to return home. They built families out of friendship, sharing not just rent, but also warmth in the harsh Parisian winters. And though the stories we recall are often gilded with nostalgia, the truth was not always so glamorous. Hunger was real. Cold was constant. Many nights, a single coat was passed between two friends who took turns venturing outside. Some of these women wrote letters back home filled with lies about their supposed success, while in reality they survived on little more than black coffee and the generosity of strangers. Yet ask them, and many would have said it was worth it, for freedom, even when difficult, was still freedom. They had tasted life outside the rules of propriety, and they could not return to the cages society had prepared for them. The cafés of Montparnasse were not just places to drink. They were theaters of existence, stages where every table became a world. You could step into La Rotonde or Le Dôme on any evening and find yourself among a cast of artists, writers, and dreamers who had little more than their ambition to warm them. At the center of this chaos, women who had refused the quiet destinies laid out for them claimed their seats as equals. It was unusual at the time, almost scandalous, to see women smoking openly, speaking loudly, or engaging in debates about art and politics with men who had been raised to believe themselves the only voices worth hearing. But these women did not soften their opinions. They argued fiercely, laughed with abandon, and dared to imagine themselves as the creators of their own stories. One could find them scribbling poems by candlelight, tearing the pages from cheap notebooks to share with strangers. Others painted portraits, not for galleries, but for the walls of their friends' rooms, where paint dripped unevenly onto already stained floors. Some of these women worked in studios so cold that they painted with gloves, their breath visible in the air, while others sang in tiny cabarets, where the applause was often drowned out by the clatter of dishes. Yet, in each of these fragile spaces, something larger than art itself was being born, a conviction that life could be lived differently. They were not following maps, because none existed. They were inventing their own directions with every step. The city was changing around them too. Paris, after the war, had become a magnet for expatriates, especially Americans escaping prohibition and the rigid expectations of their homeland. They came with notebooks and canvases, hungry for freedom, and often found themselves astonished by the sight of Parisian women who lived with such boldness. Some of the friendships formed across those cafe tables would last decades. Others were as fleeting as the flicker of a match lighting a cigarette. But for the women themselves, these nights offered a sense of belonging in a world that otherwise wished to silence them. To walk through the streets of Paris as a Bohemian woman in the 1920s was to carry both danger and liberation in equal measure. There were, of course, consequences for such defiance. Families back home often disowned them, accusing them of disgrace. Money was always scarce, and whispers followed them, whispers that labeled them immoral, reckless, or worse. But if you asked one of these women why she endured it, she might simply smile and say that a single night of freedom in Paris was worth more than a lifetime of obedience elsewhere. And so they continued, night after night, sketching, writing, drinking, dancing, as though each moment might be their last. It is easy, from our distance, to romanticize them, to picture their lives as an endless string of smoky cafés and passionate love affairs. But in truth, many of their stories were quiet and slow, filled with long hours of loneliness, of doubt, of hunger, gnawing at the edges of their ambition. Still, in the quietest moments, when the streets emptied and the lamps burned low, they held on to a strange certainty that their lives, however obscure, however forgotten, mattered simply because they were lived freely. And you, dear listener, as you lie back and let your breathing settle, may find comfort in that thought. These women are not remembered because they conquered nations or built empires, but because they chose to live outside the rules. And in doing so, they left behind fragments of courage for us to find. Perhaps you too have wondered what it might feel like to live differently, to step away from expectation. As the calm rhythm of this story carries you, let it be a gentle reminder that history is made not only by kings and generals, but also by those who dared, quietly, to live their own way. The rooms where these women lived were often no larger than closets, their windows rattling in the winter wind, their walls thin enough to hear neighbors coughing through the night. Yet even in such cramped spaces, they filled their lives with color. One painted flowers on the ceiling, another lined her shelves with pebbles collected from the Seine. They made beauty where none was expected, stitching it into the fabric of their ordinary days. In this way, their very existence was a kind of art, an art of survival, of stubborn joy. As the decade moved forward, the presence of these women became impossible to ignore. They published small magazines filled with radical ideas. They hosted gatherings where poems were read aloud, sometimes to audiences of only 5 or 6. They supported one another when money ran out, sharing bread, laughter, and tears. And slowly, quietly, they began to reshape the image of what a woman in Paris could be. When dawn came, washing the city in pale light, many of them walked home along streets littered with bottles and scraps of paper. The cafés would empty, the music would fade, and the city would return to its ordinary rhythms. But for those few hours in the night, something extraordinary had been alive, something that no one could take from them. And though most of their names have faded from memory, their echoes remain in the stories whispered across time. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable thing about these Bohemian women of Paris was not their art, nor even their courage, but their insistence on friendship as the anchor of their existence. In a society that so often measured a woman's worth by her family ties, by her role as wife or mother, they forged families of a different kind. They leaned on each other through heartbreak, through illness, through the endless uncertainty of a life lived without guarantees. One might share her last coin so another could buy paint. Another might cook a thin soup to be divided among 3. Their bonds were messy, imperfect, sometimes torn apart by jealousy or rivalry, but they were bonds nonetheless, stronger than the judgments that surrounded them. And perhaps it is in these fragile alliances that we glimpse their true defiance, a refusal to be alone in a world that tried to isolate them. The city itself seemed to encourage this defiance. Paris was a place where beauty could be found in chipped stone and crumbling walls, where the glow of a single street lamp could transform the night into poetry. The women of Montparnasse walked those streets not as silent figures in the background, but as participants in a living stage. They studied the way shadows stretched across the Seine, the way morning mist blurred the spires of Notre Dame, and they carried those images back into their work. Their lives and their art were inseparable, each feeding the other. To speak of them is not to separate biography from creation, but to understand that the two were one and the same. Still, their path was not without sacrifice. Many suffered illnesses born of poverty, tuberculosis that went untreated, malnutrition that weakened the body, exhaustion from working long hours by day and creating by night. Some never lived to see their work recognized, their paintings left in attics, their poems unpublished. Others abandoned their art entirely, pressed by the weight of survival. And yet, even in the stories that end in obscurity, there is something quietly triumphant. For in choosing to live on their own terms, even for a short while, they claimed a piece of history that belongs to no one else. It is tempting, as we drift further into their world, to pause and reflect on our own lives. Perhaps, dear listener, as you lie there with the rhythm of my voice settling around you, you might ask yourself, what are the rules you have followed without question? What are the expectations that have pressed silently against you? The women of 1920s. Paris remind us that rules, however strong, can be bent, that expectations, however heavy, can be set aside. And as you breathe, slowly, evenly, you might feel the weight of your own expectations ease just a little, replaced by the gentle hum of possibility. By the mid-1920s, Paris had become an international crossroads of creativity. Hemingway wrote in cafés only a few streets away from where women were painting portraits or scribbling verses. Josephine Baker danced with a radiance that stunned audiences, breaking barriers in ways both subtle and profound. And while these names would endure, countless others did not. Among them were women who sang in smoky bars, who acted in experimental plays, who filled sketchbooks with drawings that would never see the light of a gallery. Their anonymity does not erase their significance. Rather, it reminds us that history is not only the story of those remembered, but also of those who lived with intensity and faded quietly into time. There is something deeply soothing in that thought, to know that even forgotten lives can shape the fabric of history, that even small acts of defiance can ripple outward. The Bohemian women of Paris were not saints or heroes. They quarreled, they stumbled, they sometimes hurt one another, but they lived with an honesty that continues to speak to us. And as your eyelids grow heavier, as the sound of the world around you fades, you can let that honesty settle like a blanket. You do not need to chase perfection nor seek recognition. It is enough to breathe, to be, to live in your own quiet way. When night fell over Paris, the city transformed again. Gas lamps cast their yellow light onto rain-slick streets. Carriages gave way to the hum of automobiles, and the cafés once more came alive. A passerby might have mistaken it all for chaos. Voices rising, glasses clinking, music spilling into the air. But within that chaos, a kind of peace could be found. The women who gathered there were not seeking order nor approval. They were seeking presence, the raw, unvarnished presence of being alive in that exact moment. And perhaps that is the greatest gift they leave us, the reminder that to be fully alive, even for a fleeting instant, is enough. As we close this opening reflection, you may notice how time has softened around you. The day's concerns are no longer sharp, the edges of thought blurring into a calm haze. This is the rhythm of history told not with urgency, but with the patience of night itself. And in that patience, in that softness, we have reached the heart of our journey, the secret lives of Bohemian women in 1920s Paris, women who lived quietly, boldly, imperfectly, and who now, across the distance of time, remind us to rest, to breathe, and to let go. Paris in those years was not only a city of art and rebellion, but also a city of endless contradictions, a place where beauty and decay lived side by side, and the women who chose to call themselves free wandered through both with equal familiarity. By day, they could be seen drifting past the bookstalls along the Seine, their scarves tucked against the wind, pausing to thumb through volumes of poetry worn soft from countless hands. They rarely had the francs to purchase, but that hardly mattered. To hold the book, to taste the words, was in itself a kind of nourishment. By night, they returned to the dim rooms of Montparnasse, to gatherings where candles sputtered and wine was poured into mismatched glasses, and where arguments about painting or music could carry on until dawn. These rooms were not glamorous, and yet they held an energy that no ballroom could rival, for within them lived the stubborn belief that life could be reinvented from scratch. The walls were often cracked, the roofs leaking, the floors cold, but none of that stopped the laughter, nor the poems shouted into the smoke, nor the sketches pinned hastily to the walls, as though to remind everyone present that beauty could be born in any condition, even in poverty. And perhaps it is here that the true essence of the Bohemian women emerges, not in fame or fortune, but in the quiet insistence that even in the smallest, harshest spaces, one could create meaning. They did not wait for permission, nor for resources, nor for recognition. They simply lived and created as naturally as breathing, as though art were the only currency that mattered. Yet there was more to this existence than art alone. There were the friendships formed in the cramped stairwells of boarding houses, friendships that sometimes lasted only a season, and sometimes stretched across a lifetime. A woman arriving with nothing more than a battered suitcase might find herself welcomed by others who had arrived only months before, and in that welcome she discovered that she was no longer alone. They shared coats in the winter, shared bread when money ran out, shared laughter when despair threatened to take hold. To survive, Montparnasse was rarely a solitary act. It was a collective one, stitched together through gestures of care that defied the selfishness of the larger world. One might give away her last cigarette, another her last coin, knowing that tomorrow the favor would be returned in some other form. And in this rhythm of giving and receiving, they built a world that was both fragile and unshakable, a world that existed only because they insisted on it. But survival was not the only challenge. Respectability lingered as a shadow, following them even into their newfound freedom. Families back home sent letters filled with disappointment or anger, urging them to return, to marry, to abandon what was seen as reckless folly. Landlords eyed them with suspicion, employers dismissed them for their boldness, and the newspapers occasionally painted them as symbols of moral decline. Yet against all this, they stood firm. For many, the simple act of living in Paris on their own terms was itself an act of rebellion, an assertion that they would not be defined by others. And while this rebellion came at great cost, loneliness, hunger, and often obscurity, it was also the foundation of a life lived authentically, without disguise. It is here, dear listener, in the hush of this retelling, that I gently invite you once more to settle deeper into the calm. If these voices reach you, if their stories carry you toward rest, then let this be a quiet moment between us, a small request to support the telling, a simple click on the subscribe button, a gentle tap to like this video, helps keep these nights alive, ensures that tomorrow another story will be waiting when you seek rest again. And as you hear my words, tell me softly, to yourself if not aloud, what hour is it for you? Is it midnight, with the world outside your window silenced into sleep? Is it dawn, with the first light creeping into your room? Or perhaps it is the stillness of an afternoon where time itself seems to pause. Wherever you are, this story now belongs to you in that moment, woven into your own rhythm. And as you breathe more slowly, let us continue walking the streets of Montparnasse together. For all the poverty, for all the uncertainty, the neighborhood pulsed with a life unmatched elsewhere. Posters advertising plays and exhibitions clung to lampposts. Cafés spilled laughter onto the sidewalks. And in every corner there seemed to be someone sketching, composing, rehearsing, or dreaming. The women who moved through this world became both participants and witnesses, chroniclers of a time that was both fleeting and eternal. Some carried cameras, capturing images that now feel like fragments of memory. Others filled notebooks with lines of prose that blurred the line between diary and art. They were archivists of their own existence, unwilling to let the moment pass without leaving some trace behind. And though many of those traces have been lost, the notebooks burned, the photographs misplaced, the canvases destroyed, the act itself mattered. For to create was to declare, I was here. The music of the city was everywhere. Jazz filtered into Paris from America, carried in the suitcases of traveling musicians, and it found its way into the ears of Bohemian women who had never before heard such sounds. Its rhythms seemed to echo their own defiance, irregular, unpredictable, alive. Some learned to dance to it, their bodies moving with a freedom that startled onlookers. Others simply listened, letting the notes fill their cramped rooms with a sense of boundless possibility. In those nights, when music and laughter blurred into dawn, it seemed as though the rules of the world had been suspended, as though anything was possible, if only for a few hours. And still, there was silence too. Silence in the mornings when hunger gnawed, when letters from home brought tears, when the weight of uncertainty pressed too heavily on tired shoulders. These were the moments when doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps it was all a mistake, that perhaps they should return, abandon the dream. But then evening would come again, the lamps would flicker, and the voices of friends would pull them back into the current of life. They endured, not because it was easy, but because to abandon it would have been harder still. For to leave Montparnasse was to surrender not only a city, but an idea that life could be lived on one's own terms. And so the days bled into nights, the seasons turned, and the women of Paris in the 1920s continued their quiet rebellion. Some would achieve recognition, their names recorded in books and histories. Many more would not. Yet in the end, recognition was never the measure of their lives. The measure lay in the moments of laughter shared in candlelit rooms, in the sketches that captured the curve of a friend's face, in the letters exchanged between those who refused to let distance silence them. These small acts, repeated again and again, became the fabric of their existence. And if you close your eyes now, you can almost hear them, the faint hum of voices drifting through time, reminding you that even in obscurity, even in struggle, there is beauty worth remembering. And so the streets of Paris seem to hold their breath in those years, waiting for each newcomer to find her rhythm, to carve out her place in the strange chorus of voices that filled Montparnasse. The cafés were not only cafés, they were living theaters where every gesture, every conversation carried the weight of performance. Women who arrived with nothing but a dream and a threadbare coat soon discovered that simply sitting at a table could be an act of defiance, a way of declaring, I am here, I exist, I belong. The smell of coffee mixed with the sharper scent of cheap tobacco, glasses clinked with laughter, and all around languages collided into a music that was both confusing and intoxicating. To step into such a space was to feel as though you were stepping into history itself, not the history found in textbooks, but the kind that lingered in shadows, in whispered poems, in sketches drawn hastily on napkins before they were lost. And as you, dear listener, drift along with these recollections, notice how easily the hours begin to slip away, how the story carries you slowly, gently, the way a river carries a fallen leaf. Perhaps you are listening late at night, the lights dim, your body resting quietly, or perhaps it is early morning and the city around you is just beginning to wake. From what corner of the world have you joined us tonight? What hour glows softly on your clock as you hear the voices of another century? Wherever you are, whatever time it may be, you are part of this gentle weaving together of memory and story. And if you find yourself returning to these calm wanderings, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to linger with us again, to leave behind a small trace of your presence by liking this video. Such gestures, though simple, ripple outward, helping these quiet histories reach others who also seek the comfort of slow, steady storytelling. The rhythm of life in Montparnasse was often meager in material terms, but rich in texture. Women shared meals that might seem sparse, a loaf of bread, a pot of soup stretched thin with water, perhaps a wedge of cheese if fortune smiled. But within those meals was laughter, song, and the feeling of belonging to something larger than oneself. Hunger was real, yes, but so was the intoxicating taste of freedom. A freedom not measured in money or possessions, but in the sheer audacity of choosing to live differently, to refuse the expectations that weighed so heavily in other places. Here, in these dim apartments and crowded cafes, a woman could say, I will write, I will paint, I will dance, even if the world tells me not to. And in speaking it aloud, she made it real. Sometimes, walking through those streets, one might see a woman with paint still smudged on her hands, rushing to meet a friend, or another with ink stains on her fingers, eyes distant as though still half caught in the world of words she had been writing. There were moments of great joy, dances that spilled out into the night, friendships that felt like family, and moments of despair when illness or rejection pressed close. Yet through it all, they kept creating. Creation was survival, as necessary as bread or sleep. And in this rhythm of making and sharing, of failing and trying again, the true heartbeat of Bohemian Paris was found. Time in Montparnasse was slippery. Days blurred into nights, weeks into months. The women who came to Paris often lost track of the calendar, measuring life instead in cafés visited, poems drafted, lovers gained and lost. There was a timeless quality to the district, as though it existed outside the strict march of hours, and perhaps that is why it remains so vivid in memory even now. It was not a place of perfection, but of possibility, and possibility lingers longer than certainty. As you let your own mind drift through this gentle rhythm, imagine the quiet weight of rain against the rooftops, the flicker of lamplight across damp cobblestones, the sound of a violin escaping from a nearby window. Each detail is small, yet together they form a tapestry that invites you to linger, to close your eyes if you wish, to surrender to the slow pulse of history's quieter corners. There is no rush here, no urgency, only the unfolding of lives once lived, remembered not for their fame or their wealth, but for the courage they carried into ordinary days. And so the story stretches onward, each moment a thread connected to another, until you find yourself woven gently into it as well. And as the nights in Montparnasse lengthened, the women who gathered there found themselves part of a rhythm that felt both fragile and eternal. A rhythm made of laughter carried across cafe tables, of charcoal sketches pinned to damp walls, of words murmured in languages that blurred together until they became their own kind of music. There was no single map of this world, no guidebook that could have prepared them for what they would find, for the city itself was a shifting presence, at once cruel and generous, indifferent and embracing. In the mornings, light would spill into their tiny rooms, golden and almost forgiving, though it revealed the cracks in the plaster and the unmade beds that bore witness to long nights of work or wandering. Some mornings brought inspiration, as if the city had whispered directly into their dreams. Others brought only exhaustion, the weight of doubt pressing like a stone. Yet each day, in its way, carried them forward, even when they did not feel it. To walk through Montparnasse, then, was to be constantly reminded of how little one needed to survive, and how much one needed to feel alive. A woman could sit with a single coffee for hours, stretching its warmth as long as possible, not because the drink itself mattered, but because the act of sitting in a cafe meant she was part of something larger, part of the shared ritual of belonging. She might overhear a poet arguing with a painter, or a dancer humming under her breath as she traced lines across a notebook. She might be invited to join a table, to share in the fragments of bread and wine passed around like sacred offerings. In those small moments, the distance between stranger and friend was shorter than anywhere else. Paris, for all its noise and grandeur, could also be intimate in a way that made the world seem both vast and near. And perhaps, as you listen now, you too can feel the strange comfort of such spaces. The warmth of voices drifting around you, even if you are alone in your room. The reassurance that others, long before you, also sought connection in quiet, unassuming ways. It is a reminder that history is not only written in books, but carried in gestures, in small kindnesses that ripple outward. You might notice how your own breath slows as the story unfolds, how your body leans into the rhythm of calm recollection. I wonder, From where are you listening to this unfolding story? What time of night or morning rests upon your own clock? Whether you are nestled under blankets or simply closing your eyes for a moment of pause, you are part of this circle now. And if you feel yourself returning to this calm again and again, perhaps you will remember to subscribe, to leave behind the quiet trace of your listening by liking this video. These small gestures, gentle as they are, help keep the current flowing, help these histories continue to reach those who might find in them the same stillness you do now. The days of Montparnasse unfolded not as dramatic scenes, but as subtle, lingering impressions. A woman walking through the market might pause to touch the fabric of a scarf she could not afford, letting its softness linger against her fingertips before moving on. Another might stand at the edge of a dance hall, watching as couples swayed and spun, the music carrying her into a reverie she never quite joined but always cherished. There were quarrels too, bursts of jealousy or frustration, but even these passed quickly, absorbed into the larger tide of living. It was not perfection that made Montparnasse remarkable, but the way imperfection was embraced, turned into art, into laughter, into survival. And there were nights, so many nights, when the city itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. Gas lamps reflected in puddles left by rain, footsteps echoed against stone, and above it all the moon hung quietly, indifferent yet illuminating. Women would walk together in groups, their laughter breaking against the silence of the sleeping streets. They would speak of ideas too large for their small rooms, of futures uncertain yet vivid in their imagination. Some spoke of novels they would one day finish, others of paintings that would capture not just the eye, but the soul. And though many of those works would remain incomplete, their essence lived on in the conversations themselves, in the way speaking a dream aloud gave it breath, even if only for a moment. It is easy, from the distance of time, to romanticize these nights, to imagine them as endlessly joyous or free. But the truth, as always, is more layered. Hunger gnawed, debts loomed, illnesses spread through the damp rooms with little warning. Yet within these difficulties was a resilience that astonishes still. To endure was itself an art, a daily creation that demanded as much courage as any canvas or poem. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of these women. Not the fame that some eventually achieved, but the quiet persistence of those who never did, who nonetheless lived as though their lives themselves were works of art. Even now, as we drift together through these recollections, you might feel the strange companionship of their presence. Their footsteps, though long gone, seem to echo faintly, reminding us that every life leaves traces, even those unrecorded. And in remembering them, in speaking softly of their nights and days, we carry them forward. The rhythm of Montparnasse was not bound by clocks, yet time passed all the same. Friendships deepened, loves flickered, dreams rose and fell. But always there was the sense that something was happening here, something larger than the individuals themselves, a movement of spirit that carried each one along. And as you hear these echoes now, let them carry you too, slowly, gently, into the wide, quiet expanse of rest. And as the days folded into one another, the rhythm of Montparnasse revealed itself less as a schedule and more as a pulse, something felt rather than measured. Morning light had a way of softening even the most worn corners of those cramped apartments, and though the beds were often narrow, the walls cracked, the air heavy with the scent of coal smoke, and yesterday's bread. There was a peculiar dignity in the simplicity. The young women who lived there often laughed about their conditions, comparing whose roof leaked most during the rain, or who had managed to barter the cheapest loaf from the baker on the corner. Humor softened the edge of want, and friendship turned scarcity into something that felt almost like abundance. For what they lacked in coin or comfort, they often made up for in presence, in the simple act of showing up at one another's doors, of sitting together in silence when words felt too heavy, of reading aloud a half-finished poem, not to impress, but simply to share the burden of creation. There was something about Montparnasse that allowed one to be both utterly small and quietly infinite. A woman could vanish into the crowd, anonymous, unknown, yet at the same time she could feel as though the whole world was listening when she read a few lines of verse in the corner of a café, or when she sang softly to herself as she walked home under the lamps. The paradox was intoxicating, to disappear and to matter, both at once. Perhaps that is why so many stayed, even when hunger and hardship pressed close. For elsewhere they were invisible in a different way, diminished by expectation, bound by tradition. But here, even obscurity had its own shimmer, its own nobility. And as you listen to these reflections now, perhaps you too can sense that shimmer, faint yet steady, like the glow of a candle glimpsed through fog. Let yourself breathe into it, slowly, as though each breath were tracing the same rhythm of the city a century ago. Notice how the story stretches without rushing, how it asks nothing of you except presence. And while you linger with us here, I gently invite you, if you haven't already, to subscribe, to let this calm become part of your own nights more often. You might even press like on this very video, leaving behind a small footprint, a quiet echo of your time here. And tell me, if you wish, in the comments below, from what place in the world and at what quiet hour have you joined us? These connections, scattered yet tender, weave our own kind of Montparnasse across distance and time. The cafés themselves became temples of this fragile faith in freedom. Some, like the Rotonde or the Dôme, were already infamous, crowded with artists and wanderers who spoke too loudly and laughed too freely for the comfort of polite society. But many others were quieter, humbler, no more than a few rickety tables pushed together beneath smoky lamps. It did not matter which you entered, for the essence was the same, a gathering of those who chose to live at the edge of convention, who traded certainty for possibility. Women who might have been wives or governesses elsewhere now became models, muses, critics, and creators. And though the world outside often refused to take them seriously, within those four walls they mattered. Their words carried weight, their presence affirmed by the nods and laughter of companions who understood. It is easy to picture them there, leaning across tables scattered with notebooks, their voices weaving in and out of one another, some in French, others in English, a few in German or Italian, each thread tangled into a larger fabric of conversation. They would speak of art and philosophy, but also of the ordinary, of the price of eggs, of the trouble with the landlord, of the strange behavior of a neighbor who painted through the night. Nothing was too small to matter, for in speaking it aloud, they claimed ownership of their lives in a world that too often tried to silence them. And it was in this claiming, quiet and steady, that the true revolution of Montparnasse unfolded. Night brought its own rhythm, slower, softer, but no less alive. After the cafés emptied, After the last songs drifted into silence, the streets belonged to those who lingered. The women would walk together, arms linked, skirts brushing against the damp cobblestones. They would pause to watch the moonlight ripple across the Seine, or to listen to the faint strains of a piano from some hidden apartment. In those hours, the city seemed to lean closer, as though it too were listening, as though it too recognized the fragile beauty of lives lived without guarantees. And in this recognition, there was a kind of peace, a peace not found in wealth or fame, but in the simple knowledge that for one night more they had endured, they had created, they had lived on their own terms. The years would pass, of course, as they always do. Some of the women would find recognition, their names whispered beyond Montparnasse, their works carried into galleries or published in small journals. Others would fade, their poems lost in drawers, their canvases left unfinished, their stories remembered only by those who once shared a bottle of wine with them under the dim light of a lamp. But whether remembered or forgotten, their lives mattered equally, for each had contributed to the strange alchemy of Montparnasse, the invisible network of courage and companionship that sustained the whole. And in truth, that is what lingers longest, not the names inscribed in history, but the countless unnamed acts of defiance and tenderness that made such history possible. So as you rest here, listening, imagine yourself as part of that network too, your presence woven into theirs, your silence echoing with their laughter. For history, after all, is not a distant country, but a living memory, carried forward by each who chooses to recall it. And tonight, in the quiet of your own room, you are recalling it with us. And so the voices of Montparnasse did not fade with the dawn, but lingered in the air like smoke, carrying with them the weight of all that had been said and all that had been left unsaid. The mornings belonged to a different kind of courage. Women rose from narrow beds, their limbs still heavy from the night before, their rooms chilled by the draught slipping through cracked windows. They boiled water for coffee on small stoves, often sharing what little they had with neighbors, for generosity was a kind of unspoken law among those who lived so close to the edge. Some carried canvases under their arms, walking to studios where they would spend hours staring at blank surfaces, coaxing images out of silence. Others carried notebooks, pausing on benches or at market stalls to write down lines that pressed against their minds, as though words themselves were impatient to exist. And still others carried nothing at all, for the act of simply walking through the streets was its own form of creation, a gathering of impressions that would one day find their way into art. The rhythm of the city offered its own lessons, the rumble of carts over cobblestones, the chatter of vendors selling fish or flowers, the clatter of dishes in cafés just beginning to open. All of it became part of the fabric from which these women wove their lives. They were not separate from the city, but entwined with it, shaping and being shaped in turn. And perhaps that is why, even now, when we imagine Montparnasse, we do not see it as a place of stone and streets, but as a living being, pulsing with memory, breathing with the ghosts of those who once walked its paths. It is easy to picture one of them now, a young woman, her coat too thin for the season, her hair tucked beneath a worn hat, walking quickly against the morning chill. She passes a baker's stall, the smell of fresh bread filling the air, and though she has only enough coins for the smallest loaf, she buys it gladly, breaking it into pieces to share later with friends. She carries with her not wealth, but intention. The intention to create, to endure, to leave behind something that will outlast her hunger. And in that intention lies a kind of quiet grandeur, the kind history often overlooks, yet without which no era truly breathes. And as you drift with these images, dear listener, perhaps you notice the same quiet grandeur in your own life. The small acts of persistence that carry you forward, the unnoticed courage that sustains you. This is why we gather here, to remember that history is not only kings and wars, but the slow, steady rhythm of ordinary lives yet lived with extraordinary will. If you find these wanderings a comfort, let me gently remind you once more. Subscribe to this channel so that you may return whenever you wish to these quiet corridors of time. And if this story has reached you tonight, perhaps you will leave a like, a simple act that ripples outward in ways unseen. Tell me if you wish from where you are listening and at what hour the voices of Montparnasse reach you. These connections, delicate as they may seem, form their own kind of tapestry, binding us across time and distance. Afternoons in Montparnasse carried a different weight. The cafés grew louder, filled with artists debating passionately over politics or aesthetics, their hands gesturing wildly, their voices rising and falling like waves. Women often sat among them, not always speaking, but always listening, absorbing the currents of thought that surged through the district. Some were bold, challenging the men with sharp wit, refusing to be dismissed. Others preferred the quieter power of observation, gathering the fragments of conversation to shape later into poems or stories. Both were acts of creation. Both were ways of carving out space in a world that still too often tried to push them to the margins. And there were moments of beauty, sudden and unplanned, that seemed to make the hardships worth enduring. A violinist might begin to play in the corner of a café, and conversation would hush as the music wound its way through smoke and chatter, pulling everyone into a brief silence of shared wonder. A painter might pull a sketch from his pocket, passing it around the table as others leaned close, admiring the quick strokes that captured something fleeting yet undeniable. In those moments, it did not matter who was famous or forgotten, who had money and who did not. What mattered was the feeling, the spark that reminded them all why they had come here, why they stayed despite the hunger and the cold. Evenings unfolded in layers. Some nights were filled with laughter, with dancing that shook the floorboards until dawn. Others were quieter, spent in small rooms where 2 or 3 gathered around a single candle, reading aloud lines of poetry that had only just been written. Both kinds of nights were necessary. Both fed the soul in different ways. For the women of Montparnasse, joy and sorrow were never far apart. They lived always at the edge of both, balancing between despair and delight with the grace of tightrope walkers. And though many stumbled, though many fell, the act of walking itself was its own triumph. As the years turned, the faces of Montparnasse changed. Some left, returning home with stories too strange to explain. Others stayed, their lives becoming part of the very fabric of the neighborhood. Yet always new arrivals came, stepping off trains with wide eyes and thin purses, carrying the same mixture of fear and hope that had brought so many before them. And so the rhythm continued, an endless tide of beginnings and endings, each life brushing against the next, each leaving behind traces that lingered long after. And so too, dear listener, do you brush against this memory now, your attention joining theirs across a century. In this way, Montparnasse still lives, not in the stones of its streets, but in the act of remembering, in the stories told quietly, patiently, like this one, meant not to dazzle, but to soothe, not to rush, but to carry you slowly into rest. Let yourself drift with it now, into the calm where history and dream merge, where the voices of the past become companions to your present silence. Paris in the 1920s carried a kind of rhythm that could lull the mind if you allowed yourself to drift with it. The trams rolled along their lines with an almost hypnotic clang. The Seine flowed with an unbothered patience, and in the left bank cafés, chairs scraped against the stone floors in a repeating chorus that felt nearly meditative. In the middle of this, the Bohemian women lived as though they were both part of the scenery and separate from it, their movements often appearing unhurried, their conversations drawn out as if time itself had no authority over them. They lived on their own schedules, which made their presence feel timeless. Their apartments were rarely tidy, yet the disarray held a particular aesthetic appeal. Paints left open on a table, brushes stiffening with color, letters half written beside an ashtray, fabric draped across a chair. None of it seemed accidental, though none of it was organized either. To wander into such a space was to step into the middle of someone's thought process. Every corner whispered that creation was underway, even if no one could say what form it would take. And for those women, the act of living was itself a kind of creation. When they gathered together, whether in the corner of a cafe or inside someone's cramped room, the air seemed to thicken with talk. They discussed books that were half read, sketches that were half finished, or ideas that were half formed. They rarely reached conclusions. To them, the discussion itself was the art, not the outcome. You might sit among them, sipping slowly from a chipped cup of coffee, and realize an hour had passed without any sense of urgency. It was this gentle stretching of time that gave their world its peculiar calmness. And perhaps that is why, as you listen now, you might feel your own breathing begin to match that slower pace. Their world was not built for quick action or sharp conclusions. It was built for drifting. And as you drift, I'd like to gently remind you, if you find this journey through history soothing, consider subscribing to this channel and liking the video. It's a small gesture, yet it helps these calm explorations continue. I also wonder quietly at what time of day you are listening. Is it late at night when the city around you has already fallen asleep? Or perhaps in the soft quiet of the afternoon, when the light is beginning to dim? Wherever you are, this story travels with you at that pace. Back in Paris, the streets seemed always to hum. Newspaper vendors called out headlines. The bells of bicycles chimed. Children shouted at each other as they ran through alleys. Yet inside the cafés where the Bohemian women lingered, the sound softened. The world outside rushed forward, but inside, conversation stretched like smoke, curling into the air. A woman might lean forward to speak, her voice low and unhurried, while her companion slowly stirred a spoon through coffee that had long since cooled. Nothing about it seemed directed toward productivity, and yet these unhurried talks shaped the atmosphere of a generation. They often spoke of independence, not loudly, not in the manner of manifestos, but gently, as if independence were something to be worn like a scarf, casually and without explanation. For some, it was the independence of not returning home at night, For others, it was the independence of writing in their notebooks without the need for approval. And for many, it was simply the independence of sitting alone in a public place, unbothered by expectations. This kind of quiet independence often startled those who watched from outside. Yet for the women themselves, it was not a performance. It was simply living. Books were everywhere in their world. Some were carried in handbags, their corners bent and their pages marked with smudges from handling. Others were left open on tables, surrounded by coffee rings and crumbs. Reading was rarely a solitary act. It was social, a thing to be shared. One would read aloud a passage, pause, and then everyone would weigh in, agreeing or disagreeing, in calm tones. The book itself became less important than the conversation it sparked. To read in such a way was to stretch meaning until it filled the room, until it belonged not to the author, but to the group who held it in their hands. Evenings often came without announcement. The lamps in the cafés would flicker on, the light glowing soft and golden against the walls. Outside, the city dimmed, but inside, the warmth deepened. Women shifted their chairs closer together, lowering their voices as though the night invited secrets. Cigarette smoke thickened, curling in slow spirals toward the ceiling. In these hours, stories were exchanged, not polished stories, but fragments. One might recall a memory from a childhood town. Another might describe a dream she had seen, and yet another might confess a passing thought. None of it needed resolution. It was enough simply to speak and to be heard. What made their lives feel secretive was not that they hid them. It was that they unfolded them in places where few outside observers cared to look. Historians, politicians, and critics often dismissed such gatherings as trivial. Yet for the women themselves, these were the moments that defined them. To share ideas slowly, without the pressure of outcome, was to preserve a freedom that few others understood. Their lives were woven from countless such evenings, each one fading quietly into the next, leaving behind little more than an impression. And perhaps, as you are listening now, you can sense how such impressions accumulate. One quiet evening, then another, until time itself feels less like a sequence and more like a pool in which one drifts. This script, too, is meant to feel like that. Not urgent, not demanding, but steady and flowing. You are not asked to analyze, only to let the words pass over you like the Seine moving past its banks. In that movement, the story becomes less about them and more about your own calmness. The rhythm of their footsteps, the rhythm of their conversations, the rhythm of their silences, all of it created a kind of background music. If you were to close your eyes in a Paris cafe in 1924, you might not distinguish one woman's words from another's. You might only hear the hum of voices, the clink of cups, and the gentle slide of a chair being moved. And in that hum, you would feel something resembling rest. So they lived, not in grand declarations, but in the subtle practice of making space for themselves. Their secret lives were not dramatic. They were, instead, quietly radical. And in this quietness, they found something that continues to echo, even now, across time. The city itself seemed to lean into their rhythm. Paris had its share of noise and spectacle, the blare of car horns on the boulevards, the laughter spilling out of dance halls, the rush of waiters carrying trays through crowded restaurants. Yet the women who lived in the quieter corners of Montparnasse or Montmartre experienced another layer of the city. They knew the mornings when the streets were nearly silent. when only the soft rattle of delivery carts moved across cobblestones. They knew the afternoons when light fell at just the right angle through cafe windows, illuminating pages of notebooks in a pale glow. And they knew the nights when footsteps echoed longer, when the city slowed enough that conversations could be carried on in whispers without fear of being drowned out. Their daily lives were not glamorous in the way outsiders often imagine the 1920s to be. Many of them struggled to pay rent. Many went without proper meals, making do with bread and coffee stretched across the day. Scarves doubled as blankets. Coats hung near stoves to keep them warm. And yet, within these modest surroundings, there was a kind of richness that came not from possessions, but from presence. They were present with one another and present with themselves in ways that made life feel fuller than the narrow means suggested. It was in the smallest details that their lives revealed themselves. A woman's handwriting, looping across a notebook page, told of her temperament, quick strokes for a restless spirit, careful lettering for one more cautious. The way someone leaned back in her chair, balancing on two legs, suggested her comfort with uncertainty. The way another adjusted her hat before leaving a cafe hinted at a private ritual of self-presentation. These were not public performances, but private gestures seen only by those within the circle. And it was these gestures, more than anything else, that defined the secret texture of their lives. They often lived with contradictions. A woman might speak boldly about independence, yet still find herself writing letters late at night to someone she missed. Another might claim disinterest in appearances, yet spend an hour pinning a scarf just so before walking to a gathering. Yet these contradictions were not seen as flaws. They were simply part of the whole. The Bohemian spirit did not demand purity or consistency. It allowed space for contradictions to coexist unbothered. To live in that way was, in itself, an act of quiet rebellion against the strict categories society attempted to impose. As you listen to this, let yourself notice the calmness hidden in contradictions. Sometimes the mind wants clarity, but often it is the blurring of lines that gives rest. And if this unfolding history is accompanying you gently, you might consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video, a soft way of saying you value these journeys. I also wonder, almost absently, whether you are listening in a room filled with morning light, or whether the night has already wrapped around your space. Each listener brings a different time with them, and yet the words meet you wherever you are. The cafes where they gathered were never identical. Some were bright and busy, filled with the clatter of dishes and the hum of patrons. Others were dim, their walls stained with smoke, their tables scarred with scratches from years of use. Yet all of them provided the same kind of refuge. A woman could sit with a cup before her, a cigarette smoldering in her hand, and be left undisturbed. No one demanded she hurry. No one asked her why she was there. The cafe gave her permission simply to exist, and in that permission life could unfold at its own pace. Friendships formed slowly in these places, not through grand declarations, but through countless small moments. The lending of a book, the sharing of a pen, the offering of a sip from one's cup. These gestures bound people together more firmly than dramatic pledges ever could. The women who returned again and again to the same cafes began to recognize each other not by introduction, but by presence. Over time, presence itself became enough. Late at night, when cafes closed and streets quieted, Some of the women walked home alone. Their shoes clicked softly against the pavement, their scarves pulled tighter against the chill. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light, and their shadows stretched long behind them. There was both solitude and safety in these walks, alone, yet part of a city that never fully slept. The silence of those nights seeped into them, leaving impressions as lasting as any conversation. For others, nights were spent in shared apartments, rooms crowded with easels, canvases leaned against walls, typewriters sitting on desks, beds doubled as couches, and every surface carried the trace of work in progress. Laughter would often rise in such rooms, mixed with smoke, mixed with wine, mixed with the faint strains of a record playing in the corner. These nights had a rhythm of their own, a rhythm that blurred the boundaries between life and art, between conversation and creation. And then there were mornings again. Mornings when the same women emerged into the streets, perhaps tired, perhaps carrying the scent of smoke in their hair, yet moving forward quietly. They passed newspaper sellers, milk deliveries, school children on their way to classes. To the outside world, they may have looked ordinary. To themselves, they carried the knowledge of a life lived differently, a life both hidden and fully present. What made their lives secret was not obscurity, but the way they chose to move through the world. They revealed themselves not in headlines or public statements, but in subtle choices. To read instead of obey, to paint instead of conform, to wander instead of settle. Each choice was small, and yet together these small choices formed an entire way of being, a way that did not need recognition to feel whole. And perhaps as you rest within this narration, you can sense how such choices echo into the present. Every time a person slows down, every time someone drifts instead of rushing, every time silence is chosen over noise, there is a thread linking back to those secret lives, not through fame, but through rhythm. Paris, with all its grandeur, often overlooked them, yet they did not need the city's gaze to exist. They existed in the quiet turning of pages, in the slow swirl of coffee, in the hush of footsteps across stone. And in those small, nearly invisible acts, their lives unfolded like a secret story, meant not to be shouted, but to be felt. There was always a softness to the mornings after long nights in Paris. The sunlight arrived cautiously, first spilling across the rooftops, then sliding gently down into courtyards, finally touching the cobblestones with a pale brightness that felt almost reluctant. The Bohemian women, waking in their small apartments, did not rise quickly. Their mornings were slow affairs, drawn out like the turning of a page. Some remained in bed with notebooks resting against their knees, scribbling lines that might later become poems, or perhaps nothing at all. Others wandered to the window, pulling back curtains and watching as the city stretched awake. The sound of carts, of footsteps, of shop doors opening, carried upward. It was not noise, but a kind of low hum, steady and familiar. In these hours, before cafés filled and before obligations pressed, there was space to breathe. The women lingered in their thoughts, letting them spool out slowly, like thread unrolling from a spool. Ideas came, not in a rush, but in fragments, a half-remembered dream, a phrase overheard the night before, the curve of light on a neighbor's balcony. These fragments were enough. They did not demand completion, only acknowledgement, and in acknowledging them, life itself seemed fuller. Their apartments, though modest, reflected these rhythms. Tables bore the clutter of lived experience, ink stains spreading across wood, glasses left half filled from the night before, a shawl draped loosely across the back of a chair. None of it was arranged, yet all of it felt purposeful, as if the disarray itself told a story. Visitors often remarked on the charm of such spaces, though the women themselves rarely thought of charm. To them, the rooms simply mirrored the pace of their days, unfinished, ongoing, comfortable in imperfection. Outside, Paris moved faster. Streetcars rattled. Newspapers shouted headlines. Children hurried to school with satchels bouncing against their sides. Yet inside these quiet rooms, time felt suspended. The women dressed without haste, choosing garments that were less about fashion and more about expression. A shawl thrown loosely across the shoulders, a hat worn at an angle, a dress mended yet carried with pride. Their style was not designed for society's approval, it was designed for themselves. In that decision lay a quiet form of independence. When they eventually stepped outside, they carried this independence with them. Their footsteps were unhurried, their gazes unflinching. They walked not as if they were being observed, but as if they belonged fully to the streets themselves. Some made their way directly to familiar cafés, where tables seemed always to wait for them. Others wandered, allowing the city to lead them wherever it wished. In both cases, the act of walking was not merely practical, it was meditative, a way of merging with the city's rhythm while still retaining their own. Cafés were, once again, the centers of their worlds. By midday, chairs filled with familiar faces. Books lay open on tables, pages smudged by fingertips. Conversations began quietly, often sparked by something as small as a word read aloud. A woman might recite a line of poetry, pausing afterward as though waiting for the silence itself to respond. Another might add a thought, spoken softly, and the exchange would ripple outward. Hours passed this way, the steady layering of words forming a kind of collective hum. To sit in these spaces was to feel time dissolve. And perhaps, as you listen to this steady unfolding, you too are aware of time dissolving around you. The minutes pass unnoticed, carried on the rhythm of a calm voice. If this atmosphere helps you rest, I gently invite you to subscribe and like the video. Small actions that allow these slow journeys through forgotten corners of history to continue. I also find myself wondering, in a quiet way, what time you are listening. Are you letting this narration guide you into sleep at the end of a long day? Or are you drifting with it in the soft hours of the morning, when the world has only just begun to stir? Wherever you are, this story walks beside you. Back in Paris, the afternoon stretched long. Shadows shifted across tabletops. Coffee cooled slowly in cups. Women leaned into conversations, not with urgency, but with ease. They spoke of books, of art, of politics, though always with the sense that the talking itself mattered more than the conclusions reached. Their lives were not driven by outcomes. They were driven by presence. To be together, to share thought, to witness each other's existence, that was enough. Evenings arrived quietly, carried on the turning of lamps, on the lowering of voices, on the deepening of shadows. Some nights were spent in cafés until closing, when chairs were finally stacked on tables and lights dimmed. Other nights carried the women into gatherings in apartments where the atmosphere was softer still. Music drifted from gramophones, the scratchy sound of records filling rooms. Wine was poured, laughter rose, smoke curled into the air. In these moments, they existed outside of time, outside of judgment, outside of obligation. Their secret lives were not constructed through dramatic events, but through these patterns. Mornings of slow reflection, afternoons of drifting conversation, evenings of gentle togetherness. Day after day, these rhythms repeated, weaving a fabric of life that was both fragile and enduring. Few wrote about them at the time. Few recorded their names. Yet their presence shaped the undercurrent of a city. They lived not for recognition, but for the quiet experience of being. And so their stories persist, not in official histories, but in the echoes of spaces they once filled. The cafés, the streets, the small apartments, all still carry the trace of their rhythms. To imagine them is to feel a calmness enter, the calmness of a life lived outside of urgency. Their secret lives, though overlooked, remain open to anyone who slows down enough to sense them. Night in Paris had its own slow vocabulary. The streets, once filled with the shuffle of hurried footsteps, thinned until only a few remained. Lamps glowed softly, casting halos of gold against damp cobblestones. Shopfronts closed one by one, their shutters drawn down with a final metallic sigh. Yet for the Bohemian women, this quiet hour was not an ending. It was a beginning of another rhythm, softer than the day, but no less alive. They often stayed awake long after the city had gone still. Some sat by candlelight, their notebooks open, pens scratching slowly across pages. The words came without pressure, flowing as steadily as the flame flickered. Others painted by lamplight, their brushes moving gently over canvas. The room filled with the faint scent of oils and turpentine. A few simply sat in silence, staring out windows at the streets below, watching the last stragglers make their way home. These hours were private, yet they carried a deep richness. In them, the women found a solitude that felt not lonely, but restorative. The silence of night offered a contrast to the conversations of the day. Where afternoons were filled with shared words, nights gave room for thought to stretch inward. Many of the women cherished this balance. To be together in cafes was vital, but so too was the act of retreat. Alone, they could listen to the quiet voice within, the one that so often was drowned out by the bustle of the world. In that silence, they tended to their own spirits, unhurried, unobserved. At times, the city itself seemed to breathe with them. A distant bell might toll, its sound soft and low, fading into the night. A breeze might carry the scent of bread from a bakery, preparing for morning, mingling with the damp air. A horse-drawn cart might pass along a distant street, its wheels echoing against stone. These sounds were sparse, and yet each one folded into the stillness, creating a rhythm both delicate and enduring. Some nights drew them together instead of apart. Invitations passed quietly. A slip of paper, a whispered word, a glance across a cafe table. And so they gathered in apartments where the air grew thick with smoke and laughter, where music spun from old records, where poems were read aloud in voices softened by wine. These nights stretched until dawn, time dissolving in the haze of shared presence. There was no agenda, no need for structure. To be together was the only purpose, and it was purpose enough. The women lived in ways that seemed ordinary on the surface, yet extraordinary in their refusal to conform. They walked unchaperoned, they spoke without permission, they created without approval. In a world still reluctant to grant such freedoms, each act, no matter how small, became radical. To sit alone in a cafe, to choose a book over a conversation, to wear clothing that did not seek validation. Each gesture defied expectation, though the women themselves rarely thought of it that way. For them, it was simply life. The power of their existence lay in its subtlety. They did not shout their independence, they lived it. They did not demand recognition, they carried on without it. And in doing so, they carved out spaces of freedom in a world that often offered none. Their lives became quiet testaments to resilience, whispered stories of presence. To step into their world was to discover that rebellion can take the form of silence as much as noise, of slowness as much as urgency. As you drift through this narration, perhaps you can feel some of that subtle rebellion in your own breathing, the simple act of slowing down, of refusing the world's demand for constant speed. If this journey continues to soothe you, I invite you gently to subscribe to this channel and like the video. It helps sustain these calm wanderings through forgotten histories, and I find myself curious, softly, about the hour you are hearing this. Is the night deep around you, your room dim and still? Or is it morning, with daylight edging its way inside? Wherever you are, this quiet story keeps pace with you. In the cafés, independence was not only an idea, but a practice. Women sat with cigarettes in hand, their smoke curling upward in slow spirals. They debated art, literature, philosophy, not to win arguments, but to stretch thought. They lingered over every phrase, savoring words as though they were sips of wine. The discussions did not need to end. They simply dissolved when the café emptied or when fatigue pulled someone away. The conversations might be resumed the next day or never at all. To the women, continuity mattered less than presence. And so, time in their world did not move in straight lines. It drifted, circled, folded back upon itself. Afternoons bled into evenings, evenings into nights, nights into mornings. There was no rush to mark distinctions. Life unfolded as a steady flow, much like the river Seine, sliding past its banks. And just as the river carried reflections of bridges and sky, their days carried reflections of thought and feeling, each moment holding traces of those before it. This way of living puzzled many who observed from outside. To those accustomed to schedules and outcomes, the women's drift seemed aimless. Yet what outsiders mistook for idleness was, in truth, its opposite. It was attention. Attention to the quiet details of existence. The shade of light falling on a page, the taste of bitter coffee on the tongue, the softness of laughter filling a room. They noticed what others overlooked, and in noticing, they gave meaning to the seemingly ordinary. Their apartments were often filled with such details: a shelf lined with mismatched books, a vase holding flowers nearly wilted, a painting left incomplete, leaning against the wall. Yet each item spoke not of neglect, but of life in progress. These were not stage spaces, they were living spaces, shifting constantly as the women moved through them. To step inside was to see a life unfolding in real time, unedited, unpolished. There was beauty in that imperfection, a beauty more lasting than any carefully curated arrangement. Even their relationships carried this quality of imperfection. Friendships formed and dissolved, sometimes over small disagreements, sometimes over nothing at all. Lovers came and went, leaving traces in poems, in sketches, in letters tucked into drawers. Yet none of this unsettled them. Change was expected. Flux was part of the rhythm. To hold on tightly would have been against the very spirit of their lives. Instead, they allowed people to enter and to leave, valuing the moment of connection without demanding permanence. And so, their secret lives were less about what they achieved and more about how they lived. They achieved presence, They achieved independence. They achieved the art of drifting. In a world that prized certainty and stability, their refusal to conform became a quiet act of resistance. They were not building monuments, they were building moments. And those moments, though fragile, carried a weight that outlived them. And so, as the echoes of that Parisian decade begin to fade, we step gently away from the winding streets, the smoky cafés, and the quiet studios where lives unfolded in ways both hidden and unforgettable. The women of 1920s Paris left behind more than memories. They left impressions that shimmer just beneath the surface of history, waiting for us to pause, slow down, and notice. If you've traveled with me through these hours of calm history, I hope the story has offered you both rest and reflection. Before you drift off, I'll gently remind you, if you've enjoyed this quiet journey, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a simple like on this video. It helps us bring more of these peaceful stories to you, wherever you might be listening tonight. Perhaps you're watching in the stillness of late night, or in the soft light of morning. Perhaps you found this in a quiet moment of your day, looking for calm. Wherever you are, and whenever you're here, I thank you for joining me. Rest well, and until next time, may history keep you company in the gentlest of ways.